Okay.
What's up, man?
Question is, it said join with computer audio. Is that right?
Yeah.
There's Roger. Why am I not hearing anything? I got you. I'm good. I'm hearing something.
You hear me, right?
Yeah, and it said join with computer audio. That's right. Even though
Yeah, computer audio instead of
Ben,
phone.
if I record my Zoom, if I push my record, that gives me a backup?
Yeah, and yeah, it does give you backup. Okay. And worst case scenario, we can pull the audio from the actual Zoom recording.
Okay.
So it will be there.
Okay, great. Roger, how are you?
It's a pleasure.
I'm so glad you're here.
I'm glad I'm here too. How's my lighting? Actually, I should give you a better background than this. Do we have a minute? Let me get
sure.
Yeah, because I got this incredible painting in here.
Oh yeah.
And I can set it up so that's my background.
Okay.
Hang on, I'll be right back.
Now, Ben, I am getting a little hum that I'm not a bad one, but a little one.
Where's the hum coming from? So you don't need to be
line or something.
You don't need to be plugged
into single coil pickups, man.
You don't need to be plugged into your Zoom at all right now. You don't need to be running audio off of that because you're getting your Zoom audio.
So
and that
how do I do
just
that?
Unplug it. I mean,
it's gonna mess everything up.
If you just unplug the headphones.
If I unplug the Zoom from the computer, it will.
No, you don't have to do that. But you have a set of headphones running directly into this A6, right?
So now I don't hear anything.
You can't hear me at all?
No, I can hear you, but I don't hear me. I can't hear me.
I can't hear me either, but that's
gosh, so you just get used to that.
Yeah. That's interesting because that is only a
I can't hear a word you're saying.
Oh shoot. Hold on.
I can hear you fine. But I feel like that type of a like I can't hear myself.
Okay.
You hear me? Yeah, it's an expectation that only a live musician would have.
Yeah,
right? Because you hear everything through the monitors on stage, right?
Yeah, and that's the hardest thing when you first get the monitors. You hear the instruments, but you don't hear the people on stage or the crowd.
Oh, really?
All you hear is the instruments.
You mean when you're talking about in-ears? You're talking about in-ears.
Yes, Roger.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can do this, but I think I need to hear myself, which is fine. It's not going to mess anything up.
Okay, yeah. You do whatever makes you comfortable. I was just saying you don't need to wear the two headphones anymore. Welcome.
I know. It's like I'm underwater. It feels like I'm underwater.
Roger.
How about that painting, huh?
That is awesome.
Stanley Mouse. It was an album cover. Let me close that door.
That's great.
Yeah, Stanley has done most of our album covers.
Really?
Or a lot of them anyway. Well, yeah, we do a poster for every single show. So we've done almost 1,200 posters in 14 years.
That's awesome.
And actually 13 years. And Stanley's done a lot of them. I mean, as a percentage of 1,300, not that many, or 1,200, not that many, but he's probably done 70.
Yeah. But that's great. That's really great.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly did more for us than he did for Bill Graham.
Yeah. It's insane. Stanley Mouse, I really want to talk to you about a lot of this stuff, and there's so many
but the poster thing.
topics.
The poster thing is worth talking about because we have the Hayes Street Arts Center, so we do the poster things like really core.
That's awesome.
All right, I'm gonna record here. So Ben, I'm trying to record on my Zoom and it's just not doing anything. Does that matter?
You don't record on your Zoom. You don't even do that. You're running as an audio interface. So remember how I showed you to go into the multi-track?
Okay, so then it won't be a backup. It's not a backup.
No, it's not recording on your Zoom. It's using your computer as a storage site, and it will, as long as you've clicked the record button on there.
Audition is recording.
Okay, good. Then we've got you there, and when you export it at the end of this, export it directly into the folder for this episode.
Okay.
And then that way you won't have to do the thing where you unplug the Zoom and plug it in, and then you know what I'm talking about, like where you have to pull it out. It's obnoxious. You don't have to do that anymore. So
okay. Hey, we're talking about technology with Roger, who's one of the most advanced technological music people in like,
Showing our hands.
the country.
So Ben, where are you?
Nashville, Tennessee.
I would have guessed.
Yeah. Well,
And
yeah,
Bob,
this is
where are you? You're in
I'm
North
in
Carolina.
Hillsborough, North Carolina.
and you are in San Francisco?
I mean, yeah, close enough.
Yeah. That's great. I'll say this again, but you have no clue. I like a year and a half ago, I heard a podcast episode with you and totally changed the way that I use my technology because of it. And then
I'm
Bob
glad.
was like, do you want to have Roger McNamee on? And I was like, yeah. I was like, I don't use Waze anymore because of Roger McNamee. I just
Yeah,
deleted
well,
my phone.
then my work here is done. Okay, if you're not using Waze, then I have totally succeeded. Because Waze is so creepy. You know,
Yeah.
it's so creepy.
Well, Roger, I've been trying to get the Avett brothers off of Facebook for about a year, but I lose that
So
battle every
I don't know
time.
how you do that with a band. Okay,
I
I got to
know.
be honest with you. They're a
I know
monopoly.
you-
So that's
I know.
that, and that if we can, that's one of the things to talk about is why it's so difficult and why it's actually okay for bands to continue to be on there.
I mean, the question that when I bring that up, and after the election last year, I was like, we need to get off of Facebook. Like, there needs to be this massive exodus from Facebook. And it was like, well, what if we have to tell the fans something?
How many fans do you have on there?
I mean, I'm embarrassed. Well, first of all, I don't personally have a Facebook account.
No, but how many does the
I
Avett
don't
brothers have?
know. Hundreds
Oh,
of
okay.
thousands?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a lot.
Moonalice has more than 400,000, and we were really early adopters. So we were, we trailblazers. We did the first live concert on Facebook Live, the
Wow.
very first one, and so we pushed that frontier so hard, and we were so stuck there. And when we went dark for a month because of Stop Hate for Profit, oh man, the blowback was unbelievable.
So
Fans just didn't understand. I mean, they did understand, right? But it was like,
Well, let's start this off. Let's get this thing kicked off officially.
may I ask who Fig White is?
Fig White is one of our patrons and one of our friends. So they're
cool. Hi,
people in
Fig.
the Zoom audience who won't be like in on the call, but they're watching it live from home, and they've got a Q&A panel so that they can ask questions, and then they can upvote them. Right. So we have democracy of Q&A, and
outstanding.
I love it. And we have great supporters here. So it's fun because it's like we get to talk to brilliant people like you, and we also get to like feel like we're doing something aside from like holding up in our houses.
Yeah. No, I get it.
Yeah, and this is something that happened because of COVID.
Right.
I mean,
I get it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do this. Let me make sure I'm recording a new way for Ben and making sure I'm doing it, and it's recording.
You must be doing it because I've got a little recording light flashing on my end.
So far, so good.
So somebody's recording it.
Yeah. So as long as somebody's recording it, that's all that matters.
Wait a second. I'm not recording it.
As long as, I'm sure the Chinese are recording it, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
Russians are
absolutely.
recording it.
Oh, that's another
Absolutely.
story.
Okay.
I taught a summer class over there, and they recorded everything. But anyway, I'm Ben Sawyer.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And this is The Road to Now. And today our guest is someone who has already influenced me in the way that I use technology. He is the New York Times bestselling author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. The paperback version just came out earlier this year. And Roger McNamee, I figured we would start off by asking you, could you tell us about the most awkward 5 minutes of your professional life?
Yeah. So here's let me set a stage here. So imagine that I have been involved in Silicon Valley since before personal computers, right? So I got started there full time in 1982. So back in those days, space was still the final frontier, and that was the focus of everything. In 2006, I'd already been at that business for 24 years. I was an elder statesman. People came to me for advice all the time. And one day I got a phone call from a guy I didn't know at Facebook. He was the chief privacy officer. And the thing is that Facebook, even though it was only 2 years old, even though it only had 9 million users, I was already convinced this was the next big thing. They were doing a social media platform, And they were the first ones to understand the importance of true identity, because true identity is what keeps, trolls out. They also understood the importance of giving people control over privacy. And even though I was too old to use Facebook, I was convinced it was going to change the world. So this guy calls me up and he goes, Roger, my boss, Mark Zuckerberg, has a crisis and he needs to talk to somebody who's been around, who really understands how Silicon Valley works and can help him navigate the crisis. Would you take a meeting with him? And I'm going, yeah, next week's pretty wide open. He goes, well, how about 1 o'clock this afternoon? And I go, okay. And so he comes by my office, and you have to imagine Mark Zuckerberg at that point was 22 years old. He just had his birthday. And honest to God, guys, he looked just like Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, he came in, he's got the sandals, he's got the skinny jeans, he's got the gray hoodie, he's got the short Caesar haircut. He comes into my office. And keep in mind, in those days, I was running a fund called Elevation. My partner, co-founder, was Bono from U2. So we'd set this thing up. We were at the intersection of technology and media. We had one conference room set up like a living room with all this video game equipment in it. And that's where Mark and I met. He's sitting down, maybe no more than 3 feet from me. He's in a comfy chair, I'm in a comfy chair, but we're only 3 feet apart. And I say, Mark, we've never met. And before we start, I've got to tell you why I'm taking this meeting, because you've got something on your mind, otherwise we wouldn't be meeting. And I don't want you to think that what you've told me has influenced me. So I want to give you where I'm coming from. I said, here's the thing, man. I think you have the coolest company, certainly since Google, and maybe cooler than that. And I think before long, you're going to be bigger than Google is now. But I'm also certain that if it hasn't already happened, either Microsoft or Yahoo is going to offer $1 billion for your company, even though you don't have any revenue. They're going to offer you $1 billion. And everybody your mom and dad, your board of directors, your venture capitalists, your employees, everybody's saying, Mark, take the money. It's $1 billion is $650 million to you. You can change the world. Your venture capitalist is going to tell you, hey, I'll back your next company to be way cooler than Facebook. And I said, Mark, I know only 2 things after 24 years in the investment business. Number one, there is not one person on the face of the earth, including Steve Jobs, who had exactly the right idea at the right time, twice. And I'm telling you, Facebook is the right idea at the right time. You're never going to have another idea as cool as this one. So if you believe in this idea, you got to see it through. And the second thing that I know for certain is that if you sell this company, I don't care who you sell it to, they're going to wreck it. This is something you either got to do it yourself or give up on it. That's the scene. I've just laid this. Keep in mind, I don't know the guy. I've literally never met him. And those are the first words out of my mouth other than, hi, I'm Roger. I'm expecting some kind of feedback. I've just laid this really heavy trip on the guy. And here's what I get, right? I get a thinker pose, chin on hand. For the first minute, I'm thinking to myself, wow, he's really thinking hard about what I said. That's a sign of respect. He's 22 years old. That's pretty amazing. He's really thinking about this. At the 2-minute mark, have you ever sat in a room expecting a response from somebody who literally does nothing? But you can literally see the gears turning over his head like a cartoon character. At the 2-minute mark, it's really getting awkward. At 3 minutes, I am really uncomfortable and I'm ready to scream. But I realize I'm in the presence of like what is potentially a world record, right? I mean, I've never seen anything like this before. And I'm thinking, I got to see this through. This is a real test of my stamina. Can I hang in there and not blow up? At 4 minutes, I'm carving holes in the upholstery of the chair I'm sitting in. Finally, sometime in the 5th minute, the cartoon thing over his head hits an exclamation point. He visibly calms down. He looks at me and goes, you won't believe this. Now, I will tell you, at that point, I would have believed anything. He goes, you won't believe this. That story you just told, that's why I'm here. Every single thing you just said has just happened. You know, it was Yahoo. It was $1 billion. Everybody told him to sell out. His venture guy said he backed the next company. I mean, he said, how did you know? And I'm going, well, I didn't know, but the reason you're here is I've been here longer than anybody else. And I know these people. This is what they do. This is what they do to young guys like you. I said, the only question you need to ask is, do you want to sell? Because if you don't, I'm going to help you keep it. And he goes, no, I don't want to sell the company. And so I helped him figure out how to explain to everybody that, wait a minute, everything's going great at this company. You don't have the right to sell this out from under the founder. And the funny thing is, that first meeting, as weird as that long 5-minute delay was, which honest to God took years off my life, he was 22 years old. And he was like really together. And the thing is, I've been hanging around with tech nerds forever, right? And so he actually had a lot of very positive characteristics. I mean, tech people are all a little extreme, but he was kind of extreme in a highly functional way. And I'm thinking to myself, I could work with this guy. Long story short, the meeting was maybe half an hour in total. He leaves, he blows up the meeting or blows up the merger, calls me up like the next day and says, I want you to come by my office. I want to get to know you. And so that began a 3-year period where I was one of his advisors. And my job was really simple. I only helped him rebuild the team because everybody who'd been at the company before wanted to sell. And you can't build a company with people who don't want to be there. So,
Right.
And the key person I brought in was Sheryl Sandberg, right? So, somebody once described Sheryl Sandberg as the typhoid Mary of the internet. Well, here's the problem. When she came out of the Clinton administration, I helped to introduce her to Google, which is where she went for her first job. And then I definitely got her into Facebook, which makes me the Uber driver for typhoid Mary. And, so I felt like, yikes. So I was really active from 2006 to 2009. So by the time, they formed a business model probably by 2013. So the company I was involved in was like the pre-Facebook, right? It was the creative, youthful, energetic, not dangerous version. But there were signs, and I missed them in the early days, and it's something I will, always have to live with.
So 2016, presidential election is in full gear. You're, I guess, were you contemplating retirement, semi-retirement
No,
this time?
I
You're
had
kinda
just
hanging out.
No, here's what happened. Beginning in 2007, actually, right at the time I was getting involved with Facebook, I started to notice that the culture of Silicon Valley had changed. And it started with a company called Zynga. They made Farmville. And then it was Spotify in 2009, I think. It might have been 2008, but Mark Zuckerberg set up so that, Elevation could be one of the first investors in Spotify. I mean, they wanted Bono, obviously, in the worst way. And then I looked at it, and it was the Spotify deal. Their first big contract that we saw was with Sony, $45 million. And I want to say 42 million of it went to the label as research and development, and 3 million went to artists. And I go to Bono, I'm sorry, man, I am not going to do this. This is predatory, and it's really bad. We can't do this. And then came Airbnb and Uber, which basically said, hey, the law doesn't apply to us. We can break the law. It's no problem. At that point, I realized Silicon Valley has really changed. The culture is about being predatory. It's about ignoring the law. It's about all this stuff that I couldn't do. So I told my partners in 2012, guys, I'm done. Now, the fun didn't end until the end of 2015. So I was obligated to stick it out till then. So I retired at the end of 2015. And within a month, my wife and I are on our first real vacation after that. And I immediately start to see things going on Facebook that are like, whoa. And it started in the New Hampshire primary, or maybe it was Iowa, but it was the very beginning of the Democratic primary. And it was posts being shared by friends of mine that were coming from a page, a Facebook group called like Bay Area for Bernie or something. It was a Bernie Sanders affiliated thing. And it was complete hate speech. I mean, it was misogynistic, anti-Clinton stuff. And it was spreading so rapidly. I realized, wow, somebody's spending money to get my friends into this group. I mean, how weird is that? Because like, there's no way Bernie Sanders would have done that. This thing was like not really affiliated. I just wasn't sure who it was. And then there was an issue with Black Lives Matter a couple months later. And then in June, the United Kingdom voted on Brexit. And that is when I realized, oh my God, this thing I was involved in, the ad tools, if you use them the way they were intended to be used, but you can actually undermine an election. And I freaked out completely, and I didn't know what to do. And I sort of reached out to Facebook a little bit, but I didn't want to go after them until I really understood what I was looking at. So I went to friends in the press, and nobody cared. Like, they're totally focused on the election and Brexit, Schmexit. They just didn't care. And I finally got a guy named Walt Mossberg, who was like the dean of tech reporters. And he and his partner, Kara Swisher, had a thing called Recode. And they weren't going to cover it, but they said, why don't you write an op-ed? And they asked me that around, probably Labor Day. So September. And I had never written an op-ed before, and it took me a long time. I got it done by the end of October. And I sent it to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, because they were my friends. I'm going, guys, there is something wrong with the culture, the business model, the algorithms of Facebook that lets bad guys hurt completely innocent people. And I pointed out in 2 areas: civil rights, because Black Lives Matter, and some other things related to fair housing that I'd seen, and then related to democracy. I'm going, we got an election coming up. You got to be really careful about this stuff. And I wasn't expecting them to just like embrace that idea. But what I got was a little unnerving. They went, oh, Roger, we really appreciate reaching out, but we've taken care of all these problems. Everything's fine. Nothing to see here. But we value your opinion, so we're going to hand you off to our fixer, a guy named Dan Rose. And if there's something here, Dan will figure it out with you. So I talked to Dan like 3 days in a row. Then the election happens. And I call him the next morning, and that's where the book begins. Now, you have to imagine the opening line of the book is like, the Russians tipped the election using Facebook. Now, if you stick an F-bomb every 3rd word in that sentence, that's what I actually said, okay? I was so angry. And I was angry because, weirdly, I thought they were the victims. And I'm thinking to myself, are you guys, unless you're insane, you realize this is going to blow up your business, because Facebook's about trust. And if people decide you're responsible for tipping this election, you're doomed. And I spent 3 months pleading with Dan Rose to do the right thing, which is to go to Congress and go to the courts and go to the FBI. And let's find out what the Russians did. Let's find out what Trump did. Right? But they didn't want to have anything to do with that. And so I finally realized, oh my God, this thing I was involved in is a real problem, and they're not going to do anything about it. And I don't know anybody else is interested. So I'm faced with this choice. I'm either going to go, I'm retired, it's somebody else's problem, or I'm going to become an activist. And I had no idea what that meant.
But you've been doing it now for 4 years, basically, and you've done it well. And I think to put this in historical context, I think that your epiphany, right? And this is coming from your book and coming from from the talks I've heard from you. But what happens with Facebook is this bizarre kind of convergence of all of these forces that have been at play in tech and the world at large. And you talk about, the early utopianism of tech design and the internet. You've got that on one hand. On the other hand, you've got just changing ideologies. This is one of the things I love that you do in the book. You understand so well the history, and especially the history of economic thought. I mean, you nail it with the history of economic thought, which is like one of the things that I love. And I wonder, so much of this you got being there, seeing it, but you clearly got a lot of this from really putting time into reading history. And I wondered, what were the books that really kind of shaped this view? Because to have that realization in 2016 with the election, you had to be really well informed and see this kind of from in the big picture. So, like, what were you reading that really inspired you there?
So Ben, here's the thing. In college, I was a history major, and I particularly studied American history of the 20th century. And if you think about the job of an investment analyst, which is what I did when I began my career, it's sort of like real-time anthropology, right? You're basically studying what's going on in the culture and in the country and its politics and its economics, and then making kind of forecasts, not about what will happen, but you're making forecasts about what could happen and then figuring out what that would mean. So at each, there are branch points where you can go left or right, either Clinton wins or Trump wins, and you have to have some frame of reference for what each of those might mean. So if you think about what I've done for a living, it was always about this thing of really understanding what's going on now and what's going on recently and the history and what all that means and what that implies for what could happen next. And then I spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, if that happens, what should I be doing, right? And so I have been a politics buff my whole life. My parents were in the civil rights movement. They were very active in local politics. My father was the campaign manager for our local congressman early in his career when he needed a campaign manager. And so, I worked my first political campaign at age 4, handing out leaflets for JFK. In 1968, when I turned 12 years old, my older brothers, one of them was being drafted. And I realized that in only 6 more years, I was going to be drafted. And if Nixon got elected, that I'd be going to Vietnam. Now, keep in mind, I was only 12, and I'm thinking about when I'm 18 already. So I went to work for Gene McCarthy full time in the state of New York. In their local office, my dad would drop me off on his way to work in the morning and pick me up on his way back. And I worked every single day for like 3 months at age 12 for Gene McCarthy because I did not want to go to Vietnam. I worked for George McGovern from October of 71 through the general election in his first office in the country in New Hampshire. And, so I was always super focused on that stuff because I just think it's interesting and I think it matters, right? But the other thing is that you can't be successful in technology if you don't, or in investing, if you don't understand the culture of the group you're dealing with. And the change that took place in Silicon Valley after the internet bubble burst was really profound. Before 2002 or 3, Silicon Valley was really a weird culture that was a hybrid of the space program and the hippies. So think of the hippies came in with Atari and then with Apple, right? And Nolan Bushnell at Atari, seriously. And if you look at the history, like if you look at the impact of LSD on computer design, there's whole books written about it. There's a great book called What the Dormouse Said by the New York Times' famed technology correspondent, John Markoff, that is all about psychedelics and computer design. And that world, which was a world of empowerment, it was this utopian thing that went into the original designs of the internet that prevailed. And we were stupid. I got to be honest with you. Our intentions were great, but we're sitting there thinking, anonymity is always going to be good, even though every experiment showed things with an anonymity attract trolls. And you knew that actually anonymity was not good, but for whatever reason, we just didn't internalize that. What happened when the internet bubble burst? Venture capitalists ran and hid. And it happened by pure coincidence that a major change took place in the technology itself. Basically, about Moore's law, which is the thing about every 18 months, the power of any computer device doubles for a given price. So it's this inexorable progress in tech. Well, it turns out around 2003, you hit a threshold in processing power, memory, and storage that meant you no longer were constrained. Before that, you had to pay really close attention to what your customers were willing to pay for because you could only solve a narrow part of their problem. But suddenly, all of those laws, there was a doubling where suddenly you blew by whatever anybody needed. So you could go from, instead of listening to them, to imposing your will on them. And so when Facebook arrived, it arrived at a perfect moment. If it had been 3 years earlier, it would not have worked. You couldn't make a global product before Facebook was founded. But importantly, because suddenly there was too much of everything, the economics of creating a thing like Amazon Web Services suddenly made sense. And that was important for this reason. If you look at all the dot-coms from the bubble in the 90s, each one had to build this giant piece of infrastructure to run their website. It would cost 100 to 125 million bucks. So if you're an investor in a startup, you didn't turn that over to a 20-year-old. You got some 40-something dude who really had experience and knew what he was doing, because you were putting serious money into that thing. Well, when you could use a credit card and go to Amazon Web Services or something like that, that suddenly meant the cost of doing a startup went from 125 million to 10 million. So the risk came way down, which meant two things. Venture guys stopped being worried about risk, but it also meant a 20-year-old like Mark Zuckerberg could be a CEO. And that, I mean, it changed everything. And the guys who financed Facebook and LinkedIn were the people who'd created PayPal. So we're talking Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, right? And these guys were nothing like Steve Jobs. They were not believers in empowering people. They weren't believers in bicycles for the mind. They were believers in a very different philosophy, kind of this hyper-libertarian view that each one of us is, you know, a little bit like the Marlboro Man. You know, we're our own thing. We're responsible for everything in our own lives. And, you know, something goes wrong, that's our problem. Well, if you're an entrepreneur in tech and somebody says you're not responsible for the consequences of what you create, that's very liberating.
That's what you say about the economic philosophy that emerges like under Reaganism, right? We talked about this with Heather Cox Richardson, that what it says is, hey, whatever happens is someone else's fault. Like if something happens to you because of something that I did, well, that's your problem, right? So I'm not responsible anymore. This is why it's so brilliant the way you integrate all this.
And you do this with a 20-year-old, right? And, you know, you can literally, so the other thing that was amazing was because the risk was so low, Mark could hire all of his buddies from his college dorm. So he had a whole company of 20-somethings. So if you've ever seen the show on HBO, Silicon Valley, I mean, the joke about Silicon Valley is that it's meant to be an exaggeration. The problem is that each season was maybe an exaggeration by about an hour, right? That, you know, it's so insane that you just, the cultural shift was dramatic. And I effectively, that was not a transition I could make, right? That I was raised a certain way. There are certain, you know, for me, money is not the reason I do this, right? I really was drawn to Steve Jobs' thing of making the world a better place with technology. I mean, I was really convinced you could do that. I still believe you can do that, but you can't do it with this group of people, right? This group of people, they come from a different place. And I'm not going to make a judgment about their values. I'm just going to say to you that my values are different and I couldn't go there. And that is why I retired. And it was because I retired that I think I was able to see the things that I saw.
You know, we lost John Perry Barlow just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And he was so instrumental in the early days of the internet. He's like a founding father of the internet.
No, he truly is. And he wrote the manifesto that was, for all intents and purposes, the Declaration of Independence of the internet, right?
And so I have to wonder, like, you know, towards the end of his life, where do you think he was, and where would he be now? You know, because it was a very the internet was to be this liberating utopian place.
So I knew John very, very well. And I mean, keep in mind, I grew up as a deadhead, right? So I loved his music way before I knew him. And I knew him from when I came out to Silicon Valley. Now keep in mind, John grew up in Wyoming on a ranch. So that Marlboro Man model, that's not unfamiliar to him, right? He would have come from a world of self-reliance and all of that. But John had a big heart, right? Very, very big heart. And I think the utopian vision that he had was shared by essentially the whole industry at that time, including myself. And the fact that it didn't turn out the way we hoped hit people at different times. But if John were here today, I'm convinced he would be nodding his head on the things that I'm saying, because, you know, he didn't pass until after I'd started my work on this stuff. So I went and visited him when he was, you know, in failing health, and we talked about it. And, I think that I think he believed human beings could do better with the internet than we did. And it's hard to argue with that, right? And I think that he would share my view of the value conflict that's killing all of this, right? I mean, to me, I don't get angry at Facebook because the Russians manipulated the platform in 2016. I believe that they looked at their platform and they really had a hard time imagining anybody using it differently than they intended. So I think they were genuinely caught by surprise. What really changed it for me was in 2017 when they hired an opposition research firm to spread an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory against George Soros because, in 2018, against George Soros because he'd given a speech criticizing Facebook. And, I'm sorry, but that shows really bad intent, right? And, since then they've done a dozen other things that were similar to that. And the thing is, everything in America gets looked at through a political lens, but I think some things are better looked at through a lens of, humanism, whether you believe other people are entitled to self-determination, whether you believe that democracy is important. I happen to believe that self-determination and democracy, which are the founding principles for our Bill of Rights and our Constitution, that those are really important ideals to always work towards. And I don't think that the companies and the internet today share that view. I think they believe that they're much larger than any country, right? There are more monthly users of Facebook than there are notional Christians in the world, twice as many as there are people in China. Google looks very similar. And I think they look at that and say, well, why aren't we our own country? Why don't we get to make our own laws? And I understand why they feel that way. I just disagree with it.
Well, key to all of this, and I really, want to make sure we cover this at least a little bit for those people listening. It has to do with data, right? It has to do with your personal information.
Yeah.
And the way that these systems, these networks, Facebook, along with the developers and its development framework that it set up and then offered to other people, it harvests data. Google does the same thing. And so for those people who are skeptical, could you talk a bit about why this is the problem, this data harvesting?
There's a professor at Harvard named Shoshana Zuboff who wrote a book basically 2 years ago called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And she studied Google from its formative period and describes Google's insight that the world is full of data that previously was either a public good or a private good controlled by the people who created the data. But that if Google could get access to all of that data, it could transform the economy. It would be able to make predictions about people's behavior, and it would at the margin be able to nudge them in economically valuable ways. In effect, Google's notion was that the world is really inefficient, and with enough data, we can monetize a lot of that inefficiency. And so it's not just about the data that you put into these platforms, although you put a ton in. Remember that when you're in Facebook, let's say you have it on your phone, and let's say you leave the app open in your phone, it can track a lot of things you're doing even when you're not using the app. But there's way more to it than that. Every time you touch an electronic system, so if you're traveling, if you're making a financial transaction, if you're just moving around with your phone in your person, if you get a medical test, if you have a prescription, if you use an app, if you go around the web, almost all that data is for sale. There's a marketplace, data brokers all over the place. And the result is that Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon don't just have the data that you put in with them. They get all the data from all these other things that's for sale. And you don't even know they have it. And from that, they construct a data voodoo doll. And it is a digital representation of your life. And each firm's data voodoo doll looks a little different. Facebook's is really terrifying because there's so much personal stuff that goes on in their environment, but it doesn't matter. The other guys get really close even without Facebook stuff. And with that, they can make forecasts. So there's a famous one, which is that, you know, Amazon and Google and Facebook and Microsoft all look at women who announce that they're pregnant. And they look at the prior months, every single thing they do. And they discover there's certain patterns that people who are getting pregnant exhibit, which allows them to make a forecast whether a woman is pregnant or not. And they will sometimes know before the woman knows. Now you say to yourself, well, what's the harm? You get a Pampers ad, right? Yeah, but they also sell that information to anti-vaxxers. And that can be really, really dangerous. And so what's going on here is these guys are in the business of making predictions of your behavior. They sell certainty to marketers, but they do way more than that because they're moving forward out of just advertising. Google has a business called Sidewalk Labs. And Sidewalk Labs is about increasing the efficiency of government with algorithms. And they were going to do a project in Toronto, Ontario. A development on the waterfront there. They were going to take it over. They were going to give the city some really useful data in exchange for having control of this really attractive economic thing. And they were going to essentially make their money through a combination of controlling real estate, but more importantly, controlling everything that happened inside this space, which means that they were going to be replacing democracy and to some extent, self-determination with algorithms. Inside their space, they were going to be the law. So there was no democratic pushback on them. Now, what happened was an amazing woman named Bianca Wiley organized a resistance to this, in which I played a tiny role. And a guy named Jim Balsillie, the guy who was the founder of BlackBerry, was also deeply involved. And they organized resistance, and in the end, Google gave up on that particular project, but they're now going to go and do the same thing to the educational system in the state of New York because they've got Governor Cuomo fooled on that. And my point to you here is that there are all these things going on in the world that we don't know about. You know, think about facial recognition. Think about artificial intelligence applied to things like credit cards. Apple got in big trouble because Goldman Sachs and MasterCard, the financial partners behind this credit card, were giving different credit limits to women than men when the men and women were married to each other and had only the same bank accounts, because the algorithms just gave, you know, they gave lower limits to women. Now, you know, you've got this problem with facial recognition that none of the algorithms recognize Black people as well as white people. They don't, you know, they have, and the reason is because all this stuff is trained from the real world, and the real world is full of bias. It's very white, it's very male. And when the tech guys take all of that bias and code it into something that you can't criticize, you can't fight back on, that's bad. And that, you ask me, Roger, why are you doing this? The answer is because the future I want to live in is a human future, not a dystopia created by artificial intelligence that maintains white male patriarchy at the expense of everybody else.
So last week you had the tech heads on Capitol Hill. You wrote, I think, 3 or 4 op-eds last week. What is your analysis over what came out of that? And what do you think about Facebook recently standing up to censoring some of the president and some of the White House's posts?
So let's talk first about Congress. So you have to keep in mind that since the late 70s, we have been steadily deregulating our economy. What people have forgotten is that in capitalism, the role of government is to set the rules and enforce them fairly to maintain competition, because capitalism and democracy inherently go together, right? Having a highly distributed economy with lots of little guys is super democratic. Having a thing with monopoly, that looks like authoritarianism. And so, you know, when you deregulate, as we began to do in the late 70s, and it really accelerated under Reagan, And it's been very high rate, no matter who was president ever since. The result is that there are basically no rules. And the economy has more concentrated economic power today than at any time in 100 years. Monopolies rule in every sector, and big just beats the crap out of everybody else. So if you look at a chart of startup activity in the United States, it peaked in 1977. It's been going down steadily ever since. No matter what you hear about startups in Silicon Valley, on average, the number of startups every year declines. And look at what's going on with income. We've concentrated all the wealth in the hands of the top 1%. The bottom half has not seen any improvement in their lives in like 30 years. And 45% of the country cannot handle a surprise expense of $400. I mean, there is something deeply, deeply wrong, right? And Congress lost its ability. It was defunded and deregulated to the point where it really had no ability to deal with any of these things. So that hearing last week, which was the antitrust subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee, was a miracle. I mean, 3 years ago when I first started working with those guys, they didn't know anything about tech. Now they are experts all the way down that entire committee. That hearing was a thing of beauty. It gave me so much hope because they were wildly better prepared than the CEOs. They have hard evidence of antitrust violations against Google, Amazon, and Facebook. And they may have Facebook on perjury. I mean, this is really serious stuff. Now, here's what's depressing. All of that evidence was also held by the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and by the Federal Trade Commission, neither one of which sought any kind of prosecution. So it's like, we still got work to do to get our government working right. But I took great hope out of that. And what I've seen from my interactions with members of Congress since then is that other committees are looking at that going, hey, wait a minute, I can do that too. And so I think you're going to see people, the Energy and Commerce Committee working on, particularly next year, they'll be working on privacy in a big way. And I think they'll be working on safety. And those are really important things. And, it's a long process. These companies are so huge. They're so powerful. And they have bought off everybody. I mean, every university, every think tank, every law firm, lots of members of Congress. I mean, they grease palms like crazy. And, guess what? That's the American way. We let people do that in every industry. There's nothing illegal about that. But it is a huge obstacle to democratizing our economy again. Because right now, it's so concentrated that you ask yourself, how did Trump happen? Well, when your economy is dominated by a few people, authoritarianism is an inevitable result of that. And so we have to bust all of this up in order to, and it's going to take 10 years, but that's got to be our goal.
But one of the things that I thought was so great about your book, I dug into it this week. It's so well written and so fun that, it goes quick. Something I hadn't heard from your talks before was making the historic example of the regulations in the 20th century, right? It seems equally impossible to have regulated, AT&T or Bell Labs before. And yet, in spite of that, regulations were placed on them. They said, if you do this, it'll ruin it. But you made this great point that regulation not only prevented monopoly, it actually created all types of opportunities for other people that could use the patents by renting them out and allowed for innovation to thrive. And you proposed some new policy like this.
It's even better than that. Antitrust created the computer industry. It created Silicon Valley because the first consent decree with AT&T in 1956 specified the computer industry could no longer be tied to telephones. That was a huge change. And they owned the transistor. You put that in the public domain, which literally created Silicon Valley. The IBM antitrust case in the 60s created software as a separate category, which led to personal computers. The second AT&T case, which was an FTC case, created data networking as a separate industry. The AT&T breakup accelerated cellular phones and created the internet. And then the Microsoft case created the Google generation. And you sit there and you go, I don't know what investors are complaining about. They should be screaming for antitrust. It would be wildly better for them, wildly better for the economy, wildly better for democracy. But, it's been so long since we have had anything other than this kind of environment that most people haven't read history. They don't actually know that it can be better than this. And so they don't know to work for it. So because I looked at it, you guys figured this out because you've been talking to me. I am not the perfect messenger for this story at all. And I really expected that I would click, send up a flare and then I'd be done. And what has kept me here is that there are people like in Congress who just go, look, you're coming out of this industry. You understand how it works. You know the people. You're not anti-tech, you're pro-tech. And it's a lot easier for us to get here if somebody like you is here. And I'm going, yeah, but there are all these other people who are they understand the tech way better than I do. They understand the psychology better than I do. They understand the legal stuff better than I do. And they go, yeah, we want all them too. But somebody's got to translate all that into what we do. And would you mind doing that? And so I'm still at this, right? And I've been doing Stop Hate for Profit, which is this campaign that we ran in the month of July to get advertisers off of Facebook to protest the amplification of hate. And 1,100 advertisers joined. It was it's still ongoing. A huge number of those people are still off of it. And there's more fun coming from there. But again, that's a situation where that's led by the NAACP, Color of Change, the Anti-Defamation League, Free Press, which is a Latinx community, and Common Sense Media, which advocates for kids. So it's civil rights organizations. But again, I can be an advisor to something like that because, the whole thing, Sacha Baron Cohen, he was the whole inspiration for the thing. He really triggered it. And, he knows an awful lot about this stuff, but it's useful to have somebody around who knows the people, right?
Sacha Baron Cohen, another history major.
Oh, yeah, no. And honest to God, he reached out to me. Bono asked me to talk to him when he was preparing to give a speech last year about the role that internet platforms are playing. And that speech got huge play. Just go Sacha Baron Cohen, ADL for Anti-Defamation League, and then put speech. You can look up on the web, read it. It's one of the great speeches ever given. And I was lucky enough to be one of the people who helped him with it. But he doesn't really need me, but but it is interesting, right? Because people in all walks of life are really worried about this, right? And if you think about this, I have a musical life too, right? I play in a band that, we do in a normal year, 80 shows a year in one band, and I have another one that does probably 40 or 50.
That band's Moonalice, by the way.
Moonalice. And thank you. Yeah, if you go to moonalice.com, we have 6 brand new songs. So, and the band is cool because
live streaming every night.
Yeah, so we are the merger of 3 bands because Lester Chambers was the original singer in the Chambers Brothers, and his son joined us, and the T Sisters, who are 3 sisters who do tight harmony. And so the new album's up there. There's 6 songs that we've released so far. But so moonalice.com for that. But when we put out our first album, T-Bone Burnett was our producer, right? And T-Bone had just come off Oh Brother Where Art Thou, and he was trying to do a whole series of Americana roots albums, and he wanted to do a San Francisco album. So he asked me to put together a band because he knew I knew a lot of the players. So we had Jack Cassidy from the Airplane and G. Smith, and then all these guys who'd been playing with Phil Lesh and Bob Weir, right? So we put together this band called Moonalice. And T-Bone puts out the album, right? But at the same time, he's doing 2 other things. He's doing one with Elvis Costello. It's kind of the New York folk scene. And then he's doing like this new Nashville thing with this guy you may have heard of named Robert Plant, a woman you may have heard of called Alison Krauss. And of course, that becomes Raising Sand, which just takes over the whole world. Like T-Bone decides he's going to go on that tour and play in that band. Elvis and us, we were forgotten quickly. And so there was no point in doing anything because the world was, T-Bone was associated with Raising Sand, and he's like one of my best friends, and I don't blame him at all. It was a great thing for him. But we were just SOL. And the question is, what were we going to do about it? And so we put everything onto Facebook really early. And, we were for years the highest engagement fan page on all of Facebook. And it worked out great. And now where are we? We're totally screwed, right? And, it's like when the COVID hits, one of my bandmates decides he's going to shelter with us. Jason Crosby, you should look him up. He was the fiddle player in John McLaughlin's farewell tour of Mahavishnu Orchestra. He was about to go out with Jackson Browne this summer, but that got canceled. But he's played with everybody and their grandmother, and but he's also in Moonalice, and so he decides to shelter here. And so we do a live stream every day, 4:20 p.m. Pacific time, on Moonalice.com, but also on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the Doobie Decimal System page, ddsband.com. And when Stop Hate for Profit happens, we halt our Facebook streams. We do the streams everywhere else, right? Oh my God. I mean, what a disaster that was. I mean, we were doing, I don't know, 11 to 13,000 people a day, which if you look at we were doing it over a bunch of different places, but our aggregate number would have put us solidly in the Polestar numbers for most viewed. And the difference was we were doing it 7 days a week, right? So our weekly viewing was wildly bigger than anybody else. But of course, 80% of it was on Facebook, right? And so we turned the thing off, and some people did move, but not most people.
So this is the issue, Roger. What does it look like if we break up these monopolies? Like where else if Ava Brothers say we don't want to be on Facebook, where else can we go to? Where do you go? What do you do?
So here's the thing. What I believe, Bob, is that the first step is we have to reform the business model and the culture of Silicon Valley. Because today we're stuck. Facebook is a monopoly. There's nowhere else to go. Right? There's nowhere else. I mean, Moonalice has really tried. We've been trying to move people back to our website. It's really hard to do that. Now, here's the thing. If Facebook did not exist, I believe it would take no more than a month to reproduce it. That is, something would fill that void, and your fans would follow you there. Not all of your fans, but the ones who really care would be there almost instantaneously. The problem is, as long as Facebook is there, that alternative can't happen. So what we have to do is to change the rules so that Facebook's not allowed to clone TikTok to try to destroy it, right? It's not allowed to threaten Instagram so that it can buy it, right? That's what goes on today. And at least under today's regulations, that's not even illegal, okay? And so, but it ought to be, right? It used to be illegal, and it should be again. And this is why there's no quick cure, Bob. And when people say to me, Roger, should I get off Facebook? My attitude is only if you want to. But you should work like hell to make them reform. And that's not going to happen by them doing it voluntarily. All the stuff that you were asking me, they've labeled a couple of Trump things and they've taken a couple things down. But they changed their rules so Trump can lie in ads, right? They used to have a thing to say you couldn't lie in political ads. They changed it because Trump had ads where he lied. And there was just a story this past week in, I want to say it was originally in BuzzFeed and then on NBC, where employees were talking about how they constantly change things inside in order to not ban conservative voices that break their rules. They have two sets of rules. And, it doesn't matter what your politics are. You don't want to have companies with their thumb on the scale of democracy. That's just wrong. And, we used to have laws that very clearly prohibited that, but we've, again, over the last 40 years, gradually worn that away. And so if you look at it, we're at this place where it doesn't matter who gets elected. If we want to have a democracy, we're going to have to build a new one because the old one's in shreds. And these guys have played a huge role in that, because think about this. Their business is based on commanding our attention. The best way to hold our attention is to scare us or to make us outraged. What content does that? Hate speech, conspiracy theories, and disinformation. So they're not sincere when they tell you they're going to get rid of that stuff, because it's the lubricant for the whole business model. So when they take down the pandemic video, They only take down the first instance. Everyone that's up there with subtitles is still there. There are lots of copies of Plandemic still on there. They had a thing, 2 months later, that so-called press conference in front of the Supreme Court got, I want to say 14 million views on Facebook the first day. Plandemic only, I think, had 4 million views, right? And this was 2 months later. They'd already told you they're going to get rid of this stuff. And this thing got 14, it had 20 million views against all things on the first day. I mean, pure disinformation, telling you to use hydroxychloroquine and all this other stuff. And I mean, undermining a pandemic response, that should not be legal. And it shouldn't matter what your politics are. I mean, that's insane. And, you know, I look at this promoting white supremacy, promoting racial hatred. These guys, that's core to the business. I mean, a study that Facebook did was leaked to the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal, right? Not a liberal paper. 64% of the time when people join an extremist Facebook group, they do so because of a recommendation made by Facebook. So you ask yourself, where's all this QAnon stuff coming from? That's Facebook pushing people into these groups. Facebook is indoctrinating people in extremist perspectives. YouTube does the same thing. Instagram does the same thing. Twitter does a different version of the same thing. And I look at this and I go, you know what? We ought to have a debate about that. And maybe we're going to decide we don't want to live in a democracy. Okay. But we ought to have a real debate about it, because these guys are driving us to a place that suits their business model, but it's not democratic.
And what you're getting at here, I think, is really essential, is that people who have kind of come out in favor or against any censorship and things like this, their line has always been, it's free speech. You can't limit free speech. What you're saying is, this isn't about free speech. This is about a business model that actually drives people to these groups because it's good for them. So this is not free speech.
It's the thing that's going on here is, I don't want to censor anybody, okay? I would have left Alex Jones on Facebook and Twitter, and YouTube. But YouTube's recommendation engine recommended Alex Jones 15 billion times, more than the sum of the entire reach of the main journalistic organizations in the United States. And my point is, I'm sorry, it's the algorithmic amplification of hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories that I want to get rid of. In the battleground of ideas, all ideas should be allowed to be in the conversation. But you're not supposed to put your thumb on the scale for the most extreme and dangerous ones. You shouldn't be putting your thumb on the scale for any of them, right? And when Mark says, I should be the arbiter of truth, I agree with him. The problem is, it's a completely disingenuous statement, because he's nowhere near neutral. He actually has a very specific point of view. It's a very self-interested point of view, and it is extremely hostile to the interests of the vast majority of Americans. And I look at that and I think to myself, you know, at a different era, if your company was held liable for allowing the Russians to interfere in a presidential election, that would have been a war crime, right? The Rosenbergs were put to the electric chair for way less than that, okay? I mean, that was a different era. So you can't compare things across eras. I'm just going, that's how far we've come. We've come that far in 60 years. And, you know, you got one party sitting there saying, we like the Russians better than we like Democrats. And I'm going, hang on just a second here. That doesn't seem like a very collegial framework to bring to politics, okay? You know, as much as I might disagree with another person, if that person is another American, I am on average going to give that person the benefit of the doubt relative to a country that's clearly hostile to our interests.
Well, yeah, the government leadership of Russia. Yeah, I mean, obviously,
Well,
we
you
have
say
overlapping
obviously, but
interests.
you say that obviously, but there is a open collusion going on in this election cycle, right? It's really heavily reported. The major story from the intelligence agencies on Friday saying the Russians aren't just interfering, they're interfering on one side. Chinese are interfering not on either side, right? Iran is interfering, not clear what side, right? Maybe
So,
Democratic, but who knows? But my
right.
point is, what the hell's going on here? I mean, are
The
we a
point is, it's
banana
too easy to
republic?
do it. Why is it so easy to do it? That's the
Well, it's
problem.
so easy to do it because it happened before and there was no blowback, no punishment, no attempt to tighten anything up. And people say, well, it didn't really matter. I'm going, what are you talking about? It didn't matter.
Yeah.
Of course it mattered. It was completely decisive. I mean, and the key point is, it's not the Russians alone that did it. It was the whole package. It was, Cambridge Analytica. It was Steve Bannon and the brilliant plan he had for Trump's election campaign, where they put everything onto Facebook, and then presumably they used the stolen DNC, Democratic National Committee and Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee files to inform their targeting, because their targeting was perfect. And if you look at it, Pew Research has done a study that shows they targeted 3 groups, but the focus was on Black people, and their ability to suppress Black votes in the places they needed to suppress it was off the rails great, and way bigger than what they needed to win. Remember, they won by 78,000 votes in 3 states. And, the point is, none of that was illegal, but it should have been, right? And so you certainly shouldn't let that happen twice, not for either side, right? And nobody should be allowed to do that. And we're supposed to, I mean, we know our election stuff was hacked in 2016 by the Russians. We hope they didn't change any votes. But what have we done to make it more solid? Practically nothing. I mean, we don't seem to learn anything, right? I mean, think about this for a minute. 3 months ago, New York City, Connecticut, New Jersey, the immediate environs, they were like what, 70% of all the fatalities in the United States, 80%? Well, Texas, California, and Florida have blown by them. We didn't learn anything from Europe. We didn't learn anything from China, but we also didn't learn anything from New York. And it's like there's something in our culture where we're just like, our children is not learning, as one of our former presidents once said, and we're not learning. And I think that Facebook and Google and Twitter, Microsoft, these guys all have played a huge role in that. And, like I said, it's not up to me to make this call. My job is to start the conversation, let people think about what they want to live in, what kind of country you want to live in. Because, if we shut down the postal service, what's going to happen to all those rural people who get their medicines over the postal service, right? I mean, it's nuts. And so what are you going to do? You're just going to shut it down selectively in cities? Is that what you're going to do? I mean, how does that work? I mean, is that really the kind of country we want to live in?
Roger, when you were going through what happened in 2016, you forgot to mention that Paul Manafort gave polling data to Konstantin Klimnik, which sure went to the Russians.
And what do you think he got back, right? Nobody's ever told you what he got back. My bet was what he got back was the DCCC and DNC did, right? That would be the obvious quid pro quo there. But I don't know. That's just speculation.
So we need to sleep tonight. We need to figure out a way to sleep tonight. So let's talk about this. How can we best use tech?
So hang on just a second. I want everybody to sleep well tonight. Let me tell you why we're going to sleep well. This year, we've had a pandemic. We're having a horrible economic contraction that results from it. And then we had the murder of George Floyd. And the murder of George Floyd may be one of those pivot points that we remember for 100 years as central. Because coming as it did in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a horrible economic contraction, it's causing people to think about our country in ways they haven't generations. Think about this. 77% of Americans were polled and said that they interpret defund the police as not shutting down the police, but rather just rethinking the priorities and maybe demilitarizing. 74% of Americans believe that Black Lives Matter is an important and positive force in our politics. That's like twice what the number was 2 years ago. I mean, I view that incredibly optimistically. I think Americans right now are ready to rebuild a democracy. And I think we're ready to have a president who wants a new deal, who sits there and says, you know what? Climate change can be a massive business opportunity. Shifting our power grid and our transportation from petroleum products to renewable fuels is going to play a gazillion people, and it's going to put a shot in the arm of the economy. Rebuilding our education system around what it really needs to be, right? It's not about technology. It's about learning to think. It's about understanding history, right? It's about socialization of being a real human being. We can rebuild an educational system where everyone has equal opportunity. We're certainly going to have to rebuild our healthcare system because the current one could not respond at all, right? It's as though COVID was perfectly engineered to exploit the weaknesses in our politics, the weaknesses in our economy, and especially the weaknesses in our healthcare system. I mean, think about this. We can't make cotton swabs. We can't make PPE. We can't make tests fast enough. Why is that? We've run the economy for shareholders for 40 years, and we basically optimized everything for shareholder value, which means you moved every job to a low-cost place. Well, the pandemic disrupted all that because you couldn't ship things across borders. And Trump disrupted it because he had this nationalist approach. And the result is we can't do any of the things you need to do to respond to a pandemic. And I'm looking at that and going, you know what? We have an opportunity now to change that, to get away from manufacturing our food in giant unsafe places and get back to smaller farms and smaller factories, right? You know, get rid of all this concentration. It's not just tech, the whole economy looks like that. And, you know, if we set out to do, you know, to treat this like it was 1864 and 1933, you know, which were the last two times we had to rebuild the country, that's pretty exciting. Because if you think about, you know, what follows that, you know, if you stick with it, it produces a lot of goodness for a lot of people for a really long period of time. And so, you know, in a sense, you have to hit bottom before you can, you know, before you can rebuild something. And if this ain't bottom, I really, I mean, I shudder to think what it might be, right?
Bob, don't say anything.
Yeah, I can see he's cracking out his banjo right now.
I can be such a downer sometimes.
No, but I really think, so here's the thing. I think what we're supposed to be doing this year, and again, this is not about your politics, okay? This is about, do you want to have the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the value systems on, you know, the goals on which the country was created? Do you think those things matter? And if you do, my point is, you don't have to believe me, but just imagine for the purposes of this conversation that what I'm saying is true. And ask yourself how you would change your behavior if what I was saying was true. Because that's really the key test. And that, you asked me about how I worked as an investor. That's how I would do it. It's I would imagine something and then ask myself how I behave doing that. I would run, those are called thought experiments. And just imagine what I'm saying here is a thought experiment. Imagine that the combination of a pandemic, a massive economic contraction is really hurting people, and George Floyd gives us a chance to re-architect the country. What role do you want to have in that? I mean, number one is you got to vote, everybody. And it's going to be really hard. So we got to get ready for that. We got to work our butts off because it's going to be really hard. And I'm not telling you to vote for it. You vote for whoever you want, but everybody should participate. We should have all-time record turnout this time. Now, you know, what I want to see is Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and Walmart working with the government to create places to drop off your ballot, right? Because can't trust the postal service because it's being undermined. But there are lots of ways around that, right? And
saw that in the state of Maryland has that. They have some ballot drop-off kiosks.
Lots of states have it. I mean, in Colorado, I want to say like 70%. Colorado is all vote by mail, and I think roughly 2/3 of the ballots are returned into those ballot drop-off boxes. And so, I mean, this is why this whole conversation is so ridiculous. You got states like Washington that have been, doing nothing but vote by mail for a generation and never had a problem with it. I mean, it's just like you sit there, and someday we have to get back to the real world where facts matter, where expertise matters. And I think this is a moment we can do that, right? Because, I mean, you just look at where ignoring experts has gotten us on COVID. And seriously, if that's almost like the perfect test, right? Because you should be able to look at that and appreciate that there's a better way to do this. And I want to invite people to join, and, check out stophateforprofit.org. Cool things are still coming from there. So particularly in the near future. And so look for that. And, and ask yourself what you can do to help people get registered to vote, to help them actually vote, to make your voice heard, to realize you have something at stake here. And for young people, it's super important because you can't be on a college campus. So you're going to have to do a little work to get registered. But you got to do it. And you got to do it because otherwise, people you don't respect and people you don't like are going to be making all the decisions that drive your life. And it's not fair. But the only response is to work the problem.
Well, Roger McNamee, the book is Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. This has been a brilliant conversation. You guys check out his band Moonalice and check out Stop Hate for Profit. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, seriously, Ben, Bob, what a huge pleasure. I'm sorry if I talk too much, but I enjoyed all the people around here. And if anybody has questions that they give you, pass them along to me and I'll either record or type up answers for them. Okay.
Roger, you are the best, man. It's so great getting to know you and meeting you. And thank you so much for coming on here.
Well, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you, Amy. Amy just said us.
She said, thanks for the wonderful bit of hope tonight.
Yeah. No, there should be a lot of hope. I mean, for anybody who's wondering, activism is like the myth of Sisyphus. You're pushing a boulder up a hill and then it's constantly rolling over you. And you go, after 4 years of this, the fact that I have any optimism at all is purely a function of the fact that there is this stuff going on. And it's real, right? I mean, our neighbors, our family members are getting COVID. It's really dangerous. And our friends and family members are being hurt by the economy. Well, we shouldn't have to put up with that. We can take back the power in this country. There's 330 million of us, right? Let's just do it.
Hey, Roger, next time we have you on, we're just going to talk about music technology.
That'll be fun. That'll be fun. There's cool stuff going on. And like I said, we've now done 100, and I think today was 145 consecutive live streams. Man, have we learned a bunch of stuff. And the really scary thing is I can actually see us getting to 300, 400. And it's like, I don't know how I'm going to do it. Because as you know, if you play every single day, mentally, it gets very tiring. And,
Well, I loved in your book the way that you told the story through Moonalice, and also the fact that you were like, if you played in a cover band for a long time, that means that you know like every song. And when people get together for jam sessions, they always want you to play with them.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's how I got to know. Hey, that's a story for next time. How I got to know Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Which is from playing rock and roll. All right, take care, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Roger. Take care, everybody.